I lost him, you lost him, the world lost him. Who did we lose? We lost Charlie Kirk. Let's talk about it. Hello and welcome back to Losing It. I'm your host, Stephanie Hunter. Thank you for joining me today. It is with deep sympathies for Mr. Charlie Kirk and his family that I feel that we should talk about Charlie Kirk's death today. As maybe some of you noticed, I did take a hiatus to enjoy the last bit of summer with my family. We have some big changes as a family coming up that are very exciting, but it's definitely going to be a big change. And so we just wanted to make sure we took some time for ourselves. And I had a different video lined up for this week to sort of break back into things. And then I saw the news that Charlie Kirk had been murdered at a Turning Point USA event yesterday. And it really struck me. It really struck an emotional chord with me. And looking around on social media, I can see it struck an emotional chord with a lot of my peers. And interestingly, peers of mine that sort of fall to both sides of the spectrum from liberal to conservative. And I am a little bit fearful that this is going to signal a boiling point in what has until now been deemed a culture war, but hasn't been particularly violent. Of course, we've seen episodes. We saw the Summer of Love, we saw riots, we've seen shootings. But after each of these events, the scene starts to settle a little bit, and it seems that the majority of people who are not radicals and are not violent and are not crazy, regardless of maybe their differences of opinions, have been able to settle things back down into a reasonable discourse. And I am fearful that this sort of marks, well, for lack of a better words, a turning point in the dialogue. And I do have a lot of concerns. But first, I want to take some time to remember Charlie Kirk. Charlie Kirk is a man who definitely had my respect. He's a family man, first and foremost. And he's also someone who was a man of strong convictions. Now, of course, we're two human beings on this planet. Unsurprisingly, we did not agree about every single one of these convictions. But I respected his convictions. I respected the way he stood by his convictions. And I really respected the way that he encouraged open dialogue on campuses around the US and took time to talk to people who disagreed with him, sometimes very vehemently. And how he really touted the use of dialogue and words over the use of violence when we're tackling political subjects. And so my heart is heavy for Charlie. His wife and his kids are definitely in my prayers. And the whole thing is just very sad. I mean, someone who's only a couple years older than me, in a very similar circumstance, young family, and it breaks my heart. And I think it broke the hearts of a lot of people in my peer group, like I said before. Because looking on social media, I saw a lot of people come out and say, sort of for the first time, that, you know what, I agreed with some of his opinions, I agreed with a lot of his opinions, and I'll miss him. And I also saw a lot of people say, you know, I barely agreed with anything he's ever said, but this was completely reprehensible and a terrible thing to have happen. And I can really respect both perspectives. I think if we're on the same side of condemning political violence, that we are on the same side broadly. But I did also see some very disappointing things online, and that is the kind of rhetoric that makes me trepidatious of what we're going to see in the near future here. Now, of course, the murder of Charlie Kirk is not the only thing that happened these last couple weeks. We have seen a huge upswing in violent crime in Canada. We have seen a father be shot in front of his children during a home invasion, and we have seen a man use a gun to defend himself during a home invasion in Canada who is now being charged with murder, which is crazy. We also saw that very unfortunate stabbing that happened in Charlotte, and a lot of the rhetoric that's coming out of that, which I think should be a lot more focused on bail reform and addressing the mental health and the drug crisis going on in Canada and America, has become a very tense conversation about racism and race. And Now, with the death of Charlie Kirk, I am not going to lie, I'm feeling a little pessimistic. I'm feeling pretty bummed out about the state of the world. And, you know, I started this channel obviously not because I think the world has no faults. I get on here and I complain and I yap and I talk about things that I think could be done differently or better. But broadly, I usually do feel optimistic. I do feel that there's a point in having these discussions, not that I'm just screaming into the abyss and that there's absolutely no point in having civil dialogue. But I'm not gonna lie, this week is a bit of a tough one. And I think that we do need to take some time to really reflect on radicalism in Canada and America. And usually I stick to only talking about Canada because I like to talk about what I know and also talk about the politics that affect me personally. It doesn't feel necessarily right to have opinions about what another country should be doing with their laws or their culture, except in situations where it really affects Canada. But I think this is one situation where Canada and America are facing basically the exact same issue, and it is the radicalization, not just of one side of the aisle, of both sides of the aisle. But I think we're seeing, at least this week, a big upswing in radicalization of sort of the leftist side of things. And I by no means want to pretend that the right doesn't have their own radicals. I condemn fascism, I condemn Nazism, I condemn the radicalization on the side that is more similar to what I believe, though obviously far from being the same. But I also do really condemn the radicalization I'm seeing on the left. I feel like there is this attitude that what is radical on the left is cool and fun, and it's cool and fun to be a socialist, and it's cool and fun to be a communist, and it's cool and fun to say down with the system and let's scrap everything and burn it all down and start over. And I don't know that people have really taken the time to consider what burning it all down and starting over looks like. In light of this, I was hoping to maybe see some more people who maybe sit on the more radical side of leftism contemplating this type of political violence and contemplating what this might mean as a temperature gauge for their cause. Instead, I've seen some really disappointing rhetoric. I've seen a lot of rhetoric that you don't get to have an opinion on this if you haven't voiced an opinion condemning Israel or about Gaza, because silence is violence. I've seen a lot of rhetoric that Charlie Kirk deserved this because he's a radical and because his opinions are so perverse that violence was a reasonable answer. And, silence is not violence. You have the right to be silent on things you don't want to discuss. Opinions expressed peacefully that do not incite violence are not violence. They're just opinions you don't like. And I don't think Charlie Kirk was a radical. I think Charlie Kirk sat squarely in conservative territory. I think he had opinions that were more conservative than mine, but I do not fall into the trap that everyone right of me is a radical and everyone left of me is a radical, and I am perfect and the perfect center. By no means do I think that. I think there is a very wide swath of opinions that are acceptable in civil discourse, and Charlie Kirk's opinions fell squarely into that category. And even if they didn't, the people that I see online discussing what I deem to be very radical things, I do not wish death on them. I do not wish violence on them. I wish that they would use critical thinking. I wish that they would use their many gifts to become more educated. And I wish that in the future they are able to set aside their radicalism and be a more productive member of society. I hope maybe this wakes people up that actual violence is actually violence, and that the sort of violent rhetoric on the left, which I feel like almost sometimes people make out to seem sort of cute or funny or trivial, is not cute. It is not funny. It is not trivial. And if you find yourself espousing very violent views, I would challenge you to look within yourself and ask if what you're doing is morally correct. Because I think that a lot of culture war dialogue comes down to, you're a bad person, you're amoral if you don't believe what I believe, you're amoral for this or for believing that. And I don't know that that's really correct. I think that people with good morals can be mistaken. I think people with good morals can have difference of opinions on how to tackle something. But I do think people with good morals overwhelmingly condemn political violence. And I challenge anyone who might see this, who finds themselves identifying as a socialist or as a communist or as a radical in the left sort of space, to ask yourself if what you're doing is actually positive for society. I would challenge you to do a bit more research and a bit more soul searching. And, I would also challenge you to define what is so different from you and a fascist. I think that one side of the aisle is not immune to radicalism over the other. I think that a communist is just a fascist in different skins. And I wonder if you actually want to be that, if you really consider it. So that's where I'm going to leave you today. Keep an eye out next week. I have a, as light as these topics get, a lighter conversation. But please, whether or not you practice religion or spirituality, I would say take some time to think on Charlie and his family. Take some time to think on your own situation and if this has maybe highlighted anything for you. And take care of yourselves. And I will touch base next week. But in the meantime, you can like, follow, subscribe. If you have a longer form comment or story that you might like to share anonymously on the show eventually, you can send those emails to stephislosinit@gmail.com. That's losing it without the G. And as always, please feel free to comment with your opinion, whether you agree or disagree with me, down below. But keep it respectful. We're Canadian, for goodness sake. And I'll touch base with you next week.